So hello everyone, I am Irene and today I will be discussing about Itamar Ibn Zohar's translation theory titled The Position of Translated Literature Within the Literary Polysystem. So the topics I will be covering for today revolves around the polysystem theory, the translated literature as a system, and the position of translated literature within the literary system. So before I proceed to the theory, let us first get to know who Itamar Ibn Zohar is. Itamar Ibn Zohar is an Israeli culture or literary theorist. He worked as a culture researcher and professor at Tel Aviv University, which is located in Israel. He contributed as a pioneer of the polysystem theory on the basis of his work on Hebrew culture or literature and the theory of culture repertoires. So there's a broad recognition among historians of culture about the major role of translation which has played in shaping the national cultures. However, there's only little research being carried out so far. So here he asked, why not consider the position of translated literature within the literary, cultural, and historical context of the target culture? So the translation and translated works are just treated on an individual basis. Here, he said no awareness of the possible existence of translated literature as a particularly literary system. So this was a point made by Ibn Zohar because there might be or random instances of references to individual literary translations in various periods, but they are not always incorporated into historical accounts in any rational way. So the aim of this theory is also to analyze literary traditions, genres, and cultures as a systems of systems, also known as polysystem. So during a time when the history of literature and translation was viewed more as one stage to another in a series of steps. So we begin by Ibn Zohar's arguments, which started with the translated works that correlate in at least two ways. So A, in the way the source texts are selected by the target literature. It basically means the principles of selecting the works to be translated are determined by the situation governing the polysystem, while B, in the way they adopt the specific norms, behaviors, and policies, so which results from their relations to different literary systems. So it is like in a way that the translated works adopt specific norms and its behaviors that and it is where norms can be determined showing regularities and trends. So the central idea is to begin a study of the translated text rather than with its process of translation, such as its role, function, and reception in culture, where it is translated, and the role of culture in influencing the process of decision making in translation. So, what is a polysystem theory? A polysystem theory is an open system which consists of interrelated heterogeneous open systems. So I think it just means that the different culture is a system of system which has connections to each cultures and its diversity is evident. So the polysystem is thought about in terms of country instead of regions, if we're ever talking about the Philippines. So Ibn Zohar acknowledges that translation occupies a place in the social and literary system of the target culture, hence recognizing polysystem. So next slide is, how does polysystem function? So it functions as a system based on the relationships between a series of opposites. Of course, we are talking about the diversity in socio-cultural ways, which leads to all of its interrelations with each other. So the function depends on the opposites relationship. So that includes the center and peripheral, the primary or innovative and secondary conservative models, as well as source text and target text, translated and non-translated works. So these terms will be discussed later. So I conceive of translated literature not only as an integral system within any literary polysystem, but as a most active system within it. For Ibn Zohar, the study of literature is not in isolation, but as part of a literary system. Such systems include the language, economy, politics, and culture. So it's a need to find the position of translated literature within that literary system. So he states that translated literature may be the most active system within it because it can based on the reader's preferences in reading a text. So an example would be perhaps Philippine literature, which has been translated numerous times in English. So and then next, this part is where we ask the translation's position within the polysystem that may be imagined between its center and peripheral. So whether translated literature becomes a central system or B peripheral system. So the central system dominate and control, providing official ideologies and practices, which means it participates actively in shaping the center of the whole system, while the peripheral system represent alternative or marginal or mainstream systems. So even Zohar highlights translation literature as art in itself, so what role it plays against the one it should be played. The central here is connected with the innovatory or primary, while the peripheral here is connected with the conservatory ones. So this may be according to whether they are adapted in the culture to produce an actual text. So the texts are chosen according to their compatibility to new approaches and the supposedly innovatory role they may assume within the target literature. So when our translation is peripheral, it tends to adopt more features from the target culture, therefore becoming culture dominant, and it often provides less than satisfactory translation. So here, this part, models may become canonized or non-canonized. Canonized meaning deemed as legitimate, or in other words, not worthy of preservation, while non-canonized is usually forgotten and is not worthy of preservation. This pertains to the translated text. So a model, also known as futures, passes from a primary stage to a secondary one when it enters the system's repertoire and it becomes stabilized. So next, there are three major conditions in a translated literature which occupies a central position when when a polysystem has not yet been crystallized, when a literature is young in the process of being established. So meaning that since the literature is still young, it cannot immediately create texts of all types, and it benefits from the experience of other literature. In this way, translated literature becomes even more important to the system. Oh my god. And when a literature is either peripheral, meaning it is only within a large group of correlated literatures, or weak, or even both. So this means that within the polysystem, some literatures have taken to peripheral positions, because they were often modeled to a large extent of exterior literature, which results to a source of reshuffling and spying alternatives. So, and then the third one is when there are no turning points, crises, or literary vacuums in a literature. So this means that the historical moments where established models are no longer acceptable for a younger generation. And the literary vacuum actually mean when the native literature cannot satisfy the public expectations, it is easier for foreign literature to infiltrate the native literature. So, so in this part, translated literature may be either a center or peripheral system, does not imply that it's always wholly one or the other. As a system, it is itself satisfied, and from the point of view of polysystemic analysis, it is often from the vantage point of the central stratum that all relationships within the system are observed. So, in this part, translated literature can either become central or peripheral, but it does not necessarily imply that it is always wholly one or the other. So if in the process of translation and while on a section of translated literature, one may assume a central position, but another may remain as peripheral. So there's actually a paradox written in the essay by Evan Zohar. He said that translation becomes a means to preserve traditional tastes instead of new ideas, items, and characteristics. So in a way, it makes sense because not all polysystems are structured in the same way, and cultures do have its differences, as the because changes in culture keeps changing over time. So and then. So what consequences may the position taken by translated literature have on translational norms, behaviors, and policies? The answer to that is the distinction between a translated work and an original work in terms of literary behavior is a function of the position assumed by the translated literature at a given time. So within a poll system, by not allowing innovations, certain elements of the target literature remain untranslatable. So, but through expansion, it enables some literatures to overlap in equivalence and adequacy. So, and then Ibn Zohar stated that translation is no longer a phenomenon whose nature and borders are given once and for all, but an activity dependent on the relations within a certain cultural system. So the correlation between the social context and literature within the translation is dependent upon its positioning within the whole system. So the translation is no longer a strict system, but it is an element dependent on its relationship with the cultural context. So in the end, what position does translation take? So I guess it all just depends on the structure of the poll system and the culture of that particular literature, since it is only dependent on the relationship with the context of its culture. So, so thank you so much for watching and listening. Although there are some parts I may or may not have explained correctly, but I hope this all makes sense. And yeah, thank you so much. This is the end of my report.